Good morning. It's good to have you with us in our class period this morning. We are picking up in Hebrews chapter 4. We're going to be finishing up chapter 4, we're verses 14 through 16. And we'll finish this up and then get into chapter 5. He says in verse 14, "Seeing then that we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore come boldly before the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need." Since then we have literally having therefore. I think probably there's only a couple of English translations that so translated. I think Darby is one, and maybe the Dewey Green's version is one. But anyway, more literally having therefore. But this statement is an affirmation to an apologetic, which the writer began back in chapter 1 and verse 3, where he introduced the Son's priestly function, where he says, "When he had by himself purged our sins and sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high." Then in chapter 2 verse 17 he further sets forth Jesus as the merciful and faithful high priest. Then in chapter 3 verse 1 he calls him the high priest of our confession. This is a theme which he continues here in verse 14, and this is a theme which runs all the way through the book of Hebrews from chapter 1 all the way through chapter 10. Chapter 12 and 13 have a couple of allusions to this, but chapter 11 is the only chapter in Hebrews that mentions absolutely nothing about the priesthood of Christ or any priestly functions of Christ. But the kind of high priest, the writer is establishing Jesus as the high priest, as such a high priest as this, kind of an idea. But the kind of high priest that we have now in Christ is a superior high priest, and the writer presents us with 10 qualities of Jesus' superiority as high priest. And this stresses the superiority of the antitype over the type. The antitype is always superior to all of the typology, all of the shadows that represent it. Jesus is, as he begins here, the great high priest. And this is the only time, the only person of whom this is ever said. This cannot be said of any other high priest. Neither Aaron nor Melchizedek are ever called a great high priest. This is prefaced. But Jesus, think about it for just a moment. Jesus is also Aaron's high priest. He's also Melchizedek's high priest. Therefore, his priesthood and his office is not only unique, but it is superior. As venerated as these men were, both Melchizedek and Aaron, and as venerated as their office was, Jesus is greater than both, and his priesthood is superior to theirs. But he is also a passed through the heavens high priest. Jesus didn't merely enter the sanctuary of the tabernacle or of the earthly temple as did all the high priests who came before him. Jesus entered where no high priest had ever been privileged to enter, and that is into heaven itself, before the presence of the Almighty. He is also a divine high priest because, as the writer points out, he's the Son of God, not the son of Aaron. He's the high priest of an entirely different order, as we're going to see in our later studies, particularly when we get to chapter 8, 7 and 8. He is also a sympathetic high priest. He understands the pressures of being tempted. He was, of course, this was, of course, the duty of all high priests, particularly those who came in the line of Aaron. This was their responsibility, to be a sympathetic high priest. But no other high priest was ever able to fulfill this function in perfect order. They all fell short. But where they fell short, Jesus succeeds where they all failed. And he's also a sinless high priest. He doesn't need to first make atonement for his own sins before he can deal with mine. And that's a comfort. This also suggests that he has the right to condemn those who sin, since he, having been tempted in all points as they were, yet without sin, therefore he is justified in passing judgment on any who sin. He is also an approachable high priest. This is unique as well. While Aaron was in the Holy of Holies, no one was permitted to follow Aaron into the Holy of Holies. No one was permitted to accompany him into the tabernacle. He was constantly offering atonement, but no one could follow him into that Holy of Holies under pain of death, lest they die. But we have the privilege of following Messiah into the Holy of Holies without fear. He is also an enthroned high priest. There was no throne for Aaron in the Holy of Holies. There was no accommodations made for the high priest to be seated in the Holy of Holies. The Holy of Holies made no provision for Aaron or any of the other high priests that followed to ever sit in the presence of God. But like Melchizedek, Jesus is both king and priest, and his throne is the Holy of Holies. He's also a merciful high priest. We deserve justice, do we not? But he administers mercy, which flows out of compassion. And this is the duty of all high priests, to administer mercy, to extend mercy. But no other high priest was ever able to fulfill this properly, as was his function. Jesus did. He is a gracious and helping high priest. Now, the writer chooses a rather interesting word here for help. And as Strong points out, that the word is commonly used as a nautical term. It's used to describe critical assistance that meets an urgent need. And this is certainly certified by the phrase that follows, in time of need. Now, as Mike Tackett is fond of pointing out, mercy is getting what we deserve, grace is getting what we do not deserve. Well, what do we not deserve?
Say that again.
Said it backwards, didn't you?
Say that again.
Mercy is not getting what we deserve.
Right.
Grace is, did I say it backwards? Grace is getting what we do not deserve. That is the blessing of God. Justice would be getting the things that we actually deserve.
So mercy is a grace.
Could you call mercy grace? I wondered from time to time whether grace is something that is supplied after mercy is expended. That's my definition, so that may or may not be true. You may have to ponder on that.
Mercy and grace are interchangeable, but your statement is true. It's sin, if we could see sin like God sees sin, we'd probably have a better understanding of
Yeah.
what we don't deserve mercy or grace is however you want to use it. We don't get what we deserve.
Yeah, mercy and grace stand over above judgment and justice. You can't administer mercy and grace unless justice is first satisfied. Justice has to be satisfied. How is justice satisfied?
Jesus on the cross.
The cross. That's the justice. And as a result, what extends to us is mercy. We don't get what we deserve, which is death. What we do get is grace, which is forgiveness of sins, which we don't deserve. What we do not deserve in this context is mercy and grace to help in time of need. We don't deserve that from the Lord. What we do get is mercy and grace because of the relationship that we have with this great high priest. We not only have the privilege of coming before the throne of grace, but we can also do so boldly. And this is quite a contrast to those in the wilderness who stood before the mountain of God with fear and trembling. We have the privilege of entering into the presence of God with boldness and confidence. But because of the character of this high priest, we don't have to come with fear and trembling. We can come with confidence because the relationship is established. Our approach to the presence of God need no longer be accompanied by fear and trembling. We can approach the throne of favor without fear of being consumed in judgment. Yes.
But not without humility.
Right, not without. There's a difference between not coming without fear and coming arrogantly. We better come on our knees. That's the proper posture of approaching the Almighty, I believe. But to come boldly, that suggests the grace of God extended in place of mercy. Now, why would we dare come boldly? Because we know He is not going to administer justice. Why? Because He promised mercy and grace. All right, any questions on chapter 4?
Is confidence a good word in the place of bold?
Yes, yeah, I think
I'm
so.
confident about some things, but bold may, at least to my mind, have a different connotation.
The idea, I think, would be, I don't know if the word in the Greek is interchangeable, but the idea
Okay.
is certainly the same.
Yeah, because boldness does insinuate arrogance.
Yeah, well, in our
In our
language, yeah. All right, chapter 5.
I think that you don't want to, I'm sorry if I interrupted.
No, go ahead.
Like, put yourself in God's shoes and make the decision for God. You know,
Right,
I'm trying to say, He is His power,
yeah.
reign, whatever.
He still has the right to condemn, doesn't he? All right, chapter 5. Jesus' high priestly appointment. Now, from chapter 5 through chapter 10, we're going to see the steps of the sacrificial redemption unfold as all of the types are represented by the sacrificial system. We're going to follow these steps from chapter 5 to chapter 10. In chapter 5, we have the beginning, which is the selection of the high priest. Then in the last part of chapter 6, and then all the way through chapter 7, we see the superiority of the greater high priest. Then in chapter 8, we'll see the priest prepare the sacrifice. Then in chapter 9, we'll see where the priest slays the sacrifice as he prepares to enter the Holy of Holies. And then in chapter 10, we see the sprinkling of blood. All this from chapter 5 through chapter 10 is a picture of the Day of Atonement. Now, don't confuse the Day of Atonement with all of the arduous steps that accompanied the selection of the high priest. These are two different things, and we'll look at each of these here in a moment. Just don't confuse the two. Now, in the selection of the high priest, it begins in verses 1 through 4, saying, "For every high priest taken from among men," remember that rule when we get to chapter 7, "is appointed for men and things pertaining to God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices for sin. He can have compassion on those who are ignorant and going astray, since he himself is also set with weaknesses, or subject to weaknesses. Because of this he is required, as for the people, so also for himself, to offer sacrifices for sin. And no man takes this honor to himself, but he who is called by God, just as Aaron was." Okay, every high priest, that means there is no exception to the rule, doesn't it? Every high priest is taken or selected or chosen out of man. And man then is the passive participant in the process. He has nothing to say on the matter. Who appoints the high priest? God does. Did he give Aaron a choice? He said, "You're going to be the high priest." End story. So man is the passive participant in the process. God alone chooses whom he will accept as the one who officiates at his altar. From among men. Why from among men? Why is this important to the Hebrew writer?
Jesus wasn't chosen from among men. Well, the human side of him was, but the divine side wasn't.
He's still chosen from among men. He's the son of David. That's the whole point. Every high priest is chosen from among, and he makes that comparison to whom? Jesus. He's no exception.
I don't know what you're saying.
Huh?
I don't understand.
In other words, every high priest has to be a man. In chapter 10, the Hebrew writer is going to confirm that all of this that he became man, he was given a body of flesh for this purpose. Now, why is this important? I think it's for the purpose of empathetic identity, number one. The needs of the people demand it. The Levitical priest was himself beset with weaknesses, and when dealing with the sins of others at the altar, what did he first have to do? He had to make atonement for himself. He has to consider his own weaknesses, his own struggles with sin. He has to first offer an atonement for himself while the congregation looks on. That should be a rather humbling experience. He's offering this bull, which is the most expensive on the repertoire of animal sacrifices. He offers this bull for himself, which is the appropriate sacrifice for the high priest or anyone who is a priestly official. He offers this bull for himself, and he does so in the sight of all. This is speaking of the Day of Atonement. He's offering this in the sight of all. He must do this before he has the right to offer atonement for the sins of the others. What does this do? I think, first of all, it lessens the critical factor. I think he's likely to be less critical of and self-exalting and less judgmental of the offender. He's more sympathetic. He's
More
remembering the bull he just had to sacrifice for himself as he considers the sins of this offender. So it lessens the critical factor. I think this should create an attitude of humility. Would you not think so?
More relatable. as
Well,
far as the
relatable,
people are
yes.
concerned.
I'm a sinner just like you are, and I understand. And that also enhances the capacity for gentleness and compassion, because more particularly for those offenders who may not know better, what is one of the qualifications of the high priest? What is one of his duties? To be patient with those who are ignorant and unlearned, as we'll look at in a later text. So, but when the high priest sins, he should know better. So he has a higher responsibility, yes.
Well, this goes back to what we talked about in the last chapter. You approach the throne of God with confidence but humility. It's the same thing, what you're saying here. He approaches this altar with the knowledge that he's sinful.
Yeah. Yeah, he's got to sprinkle, he's got to kill that bull, then he's got to take the blood into the Holy of Holies. He's approaching the presence of God, and he's got to sprinkle that blood. What is the attitude? Because I see that bull had to die, and now I've got to make atonement for what I've done in the very presence of God. That's got to be a humbling experience. Does the high priest do that boldly under the law? I don't think he does. There's always a constant fear of death, because if he enters with any uncleanness, he dies. Got to be a humbling experience. But the greater offense certainly belongs to the high priest, because when he sins, he should know better. That's why he offers the bull. You have the bull that's offered for the priests. You have the goat, which is offered. I believe the goat is also offered for government officials, those types of offices. The goat is offered for the people of the congregation on the Day of Atonement. Then you have the lamb sacrifice, which is still a lower grade sacrifice, and for different reasons. And then you have the 2 turtle doves, which is the offering of the very poor. And for the poorest of the poor, you have the offering of, I know you know,
I do.
a tenth of an ephah of fine flour. Yes,
So do sacrifices happen today?
not that's acceptable for the Lord. I mean, what?
No, I mean, but do they
For the
happen?
Jews?
Yeah.
Nothing like what is required here. In fact, I don't think blood sacrifices are offered anymore at all.
So why do they stop?
You'd have to ask them that. I would suggest they stop because they have no regard for Scripture. They didn't have any regard for their own law.
But after the temple was destroyed, the whole framework part, and they were
Priesthood.
scattered.
Yeah.
And there's Orthodox Jews in New York. I never did ask one of them. There are very few of them. I never asked one of them that question, what they did in place of sacrifices, or if they.
No.
Most of them are what they call Reformed Jews, and they,
Yeah.
like you said, they have no more. It's just the Jewish culture and history that they're so, and they're very proud of that.
Yeah.
Proud to be Jews.
And
But,
so
but
we're
as
in their
far,
little hats.
but as far as a relationship with God, or really a belief in God, there's not much there. The ones I came in contact with.
I've talked to a few, it's been years back, not very many. But I was under the impression from them that there is no blood sacrifices offered at all. In fact, one of them told me that to kill anything is sin.
When the temple was destroyed, they lost their genealogy.
There's no priesthood, there's not a Jew alive today can tell you what line he comes from,
And that was
what
very
family.
important.
Yeah, you can't have the priestly, you can't have the sacrifices without the priesthood.
So they don't have a priesthood?
They don't have there is no priesthood.
They lost their genealogy.
when Rome sacked Jerusalem and the temple was destroyed along with it was all of the records of the Jewish genealogy.
So how do they worship?
I don't keep up with it. You can go online and look at all of their practices and how they do things, and I've browsed through it a time or two, but I don't really know all of the integral parts of their services.
Synagogue worship actually replaced what they did in the temple.
Mhm.
I'm not saying they did the same thing, but the synagogue is at the heart of it, particularly both Reformed and Orthodox ones. It's just that, like you say, the sacrificial system, basically in 70 AD, as you said, when Rome totally destroyed not just the temple, but just scattered, the Jews, it came to an end. The system came to an end
Yeah.
as a practical thing.
The closest thing to a sacrifice that they may still do, if they still do it that way, would be the Passover. If they still slaughter the Passover lamb. That's the closest thing to a sacrifice that they may still observe. But every high priest is taken out of man because the need for mediation is a uniquely human need. Therefore, it's going to have to be supplied out of man. It's man who sinned, therefore mediation and atonement must come out of man. Is appointed. Actually, this speaks of something that's set up or set apart for an assigned function, set apart on behalf of men, in other words, for man's benefit, to satisfy the spiritual needs of man. This is a triad of worship consisting of the worshiper, the high priest, and God. This is a worship triad. And the high priest, what is his position in this triad structure? If you had a triangle, and you put the worshiper, you put God, and you put the high priest at the apex.
Is he the mediator?
He's the mediator. His purpose in his position is to bring these two together. So you have this triadic structure. The high priest stands in the apex position to connect the worshiper to God. And in the process, what goes to God are all of the elements of contrition. You have repentance, you have sorrow for sin, you have the broken and contrite heart, you have consecration, praise, honor, glory, thanksgiving. All of these are being offered to God. But what does the worshiper receive? Forgiveness, love, mercy, grace. This is a reciprocal relationship. To the worshiper goes all of the goodness that God can bestow. Yes?
Okay, so if you are a Jew in the New Testament times, and you became baptized and became a Christian, do you leave Judaism completely?
This was a real struggle for Christian Jews. Could you continue to practice the law as a Christian? You could. Paul even did on occasion. He,
As a matter of culture?
right. He did it as a matter of culture to
Influence?
keep from driving a wedge between him and the Jews who might convert to Christianity. He still observed the circumcision. He circumcised Timothy for that very reason. He also observed the Nazirite vow on an occasion This was something governed by the law. He kept the Sabbath from time to time, particularly when he would go into communities where there was a synagogue, and he would go there and worship with the Jews. Yes, sir.
He always did it as a matter of indifference.
Yeah,
In Titus's case, when these Jewish Christians were demanding it as a matter of salvation, he refused to
Yeah.
have Titus circumcised.
yeah. Yeah, he did it as a way of keeping the peace, so that no doors would be slammed on him in the preaching of the gospel. Did he do it as a matter of something that was binding? No, it wasn't binding on him. He didn't have to do any of these things. And he was very vocal about it.
Became all things to all.
Yeah, he became all things to all men. Now, that has its qualifications, of course. But the high priest is appointed, it says, to offer both gifts and sacrifices for sin. Now, the gift, the gulf that separates God from the worshiper can only be bridged on God's terms, can't it? We don't get to choose how we bridge that distance. And the only way that we can bridge that distance, and the only way that distance can be bridged, is through the mediator, the high priest. And Jesus is our mediating high priest. There's one God, there's one mediator between God and man, the man Jesus Christ, Paul says in 1 Timothy 2. But our gifts and sacrifices are not accepted by God except by the hands of the high priest. What was it Jesus said? No man comes to the Father except through me. That doesn't apply just to salvation. That applies to worship. If you want to come to the Father, come through me. Let's see. Let me go ahead and put this in here. What are our gifts of sacrifice, do you suppose? The high priest is the mediator who offered our gifts and sacrifices to the Lord. What are our gifts and sacrifices? He mentions this in chapter 13, by the way, verses 15 and 16. Therefore, by him let us continually offer the sacrifices of praise to God. That is, and he qualifies this, the fruit of the lips, giving thanks to his name, doing good, sharing. With such sacrifices, God is well pleased. So these are the kind of sacrifices we offer. These are offered not by our own hand, they are extended to the Father by the hands of the high priest. Just as the wave offering was extended to heaven by the hands of the high priest. The unworthiness of man. Without the function of the high priest who offers these things on our behalf, we have absolutely no access to God. God will not accept our gifts and our sacrifices from our own hands. This was intended to impress upon Israel their unworthiness, the unworthiness of man, and the holiness of God, the unapproachability of God. And without Jesus as our high priest, God is just as unapproachable to us as he was to the Jews under the law. We're just about out of time here, so I'm going to stop right there. And we're going to pick up next week looking at the appointment of Aaron and make some comparisons and contrasts between the appointment of Aaron as high priest and Jesus' appointment as high priest. Anyone have any questions or comments? No question, well, that's good, I probably couldn't answer anyway.